gonna have to shoot. You're gonna have to
get back! Get back!
5 years in August. I don't miss a day, go up a month, go and bring flowers. I had to bury what they found.
This young mother was shot 4 times in the head, while her baby boy sat in a playpen a few feet away. And the man who pulled the trigger was the father of that same child. Before we get into how a night like that even becomes possible, watch her father, one of the biggest names in Jamaican music, try to make sense of losing his little girl.
Question the Almighty, saying, but sometimes you have to wonder if God really there still. Because more time when something go on, you know. But me I hold it, people. You know, me I hold it. Me I hold it. See?
That is the first story, and it is heavy enough on its own. The second one is worse in a way that is hard to even put into words, because the woman at the center of it did not just take a life, she took a machete to the body afterward, and then she went out searching for the man she killed, alongside his own mother. Listen to how a local reporter had to break the news to the whole city.
Facebook page, they're a happy couple. He calls her his ride or die.
And the third one is the case that an entire generation online will never be able to forget, because the killer filmed it himself, picked a total stranger at random, and put the whole thing on Facebook for the world to press play on. Hold that thought, because we are starting with the young mother. And the first thing you have to understand is exactly who she was, before any of this darkness ever touched her. Brianna Destiny McCoy was 23 years old. She was born on September 22, 1999, came up with strong Jamaican roots on her father's side, and carried his name through a world that already knew exactly who her father was. She spent her childhood years crossing from Jamaica to the United States, and she built her adult life in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where she settled into the North End and worked hard to take care of herself and her son. She started out as part of the team at Yankee Stadium back in 2018, where coworkers said she brightened their days. And more recently, she had taken a job as a bottle server at a lounge called In the City on Fairfield Avenue. The people who worked beside her kept describing her the same way, as someone who was warm and reserved at the very same time, a girl who did not talk to a whole lot of people, but was still cool with everybody she met. After she was gone, her coworkers gathered outside that same lounge, released pink and blue balloons into the sky, and lit candles under a screen showing her photos framed inside a heart. And one of the people who knew her stood in front of that crowd and tried to explain what she meant to them.
You know, everyone had their relationship with Bree, whether it's, you know, for a second, for years, for weeks. I know I only knew her for 3 months, and it hurts me dearly.
She was reserved, even in a job built around being seen, and her friends held on to the small, ordinary things about her, the way she clicked with her little circle and still stayed easy with everyone else. Listen to how one of them described the woman behind the bottle service smile before the crowd said goodbye.
Even though she was a bottle girl and she worked in the bar, and she was really reserved because she never really talked to much people. She'd have her clique that she clicked with, but she's cool with everybody.
To understand why Brianna's death sent a shock all the way back to Jamaica, you have to understand her father. His name is Garfield McCoy, but nobody in the music world calls him that, because for more than 40 years he has gone by Ricky Trooper, one of the most feared sound system selectors the island has ever produced. He came up poor in the countryside with no father in the picture, built little toy speakers out of mud and old soap boxes as a small child, and by the time he was 10 years old, he was already selecting records on a sound system in Spanish Town, telling anyone who asked that music was the only work he had ever really known, and that from that age he never once did a 9-to-5. He was the oldest boy among his siblings and grew up carrying the weight of a father figure long before he was grown himself, which is worth remembering when you watch how completely this loss undid him. He rose to become the lead selector for the legendary Mighty Kilimanjaro, and he picked up nicknames that told you everything about how he moved inside a clash. Names like the Serial Killer and the Killing Machine, because when he stepped up against a rival sound, he ended their whole night. He later left to build his own sound, Sound Trooper, which went on to win the Death Before Dishonor World Clash in 2006. And along the way, he helped push some of the biggest names in the culture, from Sizzla to Luciano to Beanie Man. His name is stitched into the biggest clash moments the culture has, From the 1995 showdown against Brooklyn's King Addies in Portmore, that many people still call the greatest clash of all time, to a famous win over British selector David Rodigan 2 years later. Even his troubles carried that same larger-than-life weight, since his United States visa was revoked back in 2010, alongside a handful of major dancehall names, a ban that lasted more than a decade. In 2024, the industry gave him a Lifetime Achievement Award for decades of service to Jamaican music. This is a man who spent his life standing in front of thousands of people and controlling every corner of the room, and none of that experience prepared him for the phone call that was coming. On Brianna's side of the family, there was that same closeness. Her mother, Camille Hemmings, came from a large Jamaican family, and Brianna stayed tight with her relatives, including a cousin named Brittany Harris, who later stood at her vigil and told people that Brianna was genuine, kind, and loving, the kind of person whose laugh played back in your head and who lit up any room she entered. Around 40 loved ones came out to that candlelight vigil in April 2023, releasing balloons and lighting candles for a young mother whose little boy Xander had been born only about a year and a half earlier. A celebration of her life was held the following month at a church in Bridgeport before she was laid to rest, and the mourners kept returning to the same idea, that a beautiful person with real dreams and aspirations had been taken before she ever got the chance to see them through. The man at the center of Brianna's ending is Derek Francis, a man who also went by the name Ainsley Forbes. He was born in Kingston, Jamaica, around 1982, which made him roughly 40 years old at the time of the killing, and 43 by the time a judge finally sentenced him. So he was old enough to be nearly twice Brianna's age. He lived mostly in the Bronx while keeping strong ties to Bridgeport, and the two of them shared a condo together in the north end of the city. They were the parents of a little boy named Xander, who was only around 18 months old when everything fell apart. On paper, it looked like a young family finding its way. In reality, the relationship had been sliding towards something dangerous for a long time, and the people living around them could hear it. Here is the part that turns this from a rocky romance into a warning that everyone somehow missed. Bridgeport police had already been called to that home several times for domestic incidents, and the most recent of those calls came on February 23, 2023, which was only weeks before she died. A neighbor who lived in the same complex would later stand up in court and say she had heard several loud fights between the two of them and had even confronted Francis directly about putting his hands on her. And on the very day it all ended, Francis was not just a boyfriend who lost his temper in the moment. He was a man who was already being sought by police for a prior domestic assault on Brianna. The danger had already been reported, already been written down in a police file, and the system simply moved too slowly to get in front of it. The morning of April 6, 2023 began like any other day, and it turned into the worst one that family will ever know. Francis had come back to the apartment on Vinchelette Street with their son, and not long after that, an argument started to build inside the unit. A neighbor who was close enough to hear it later told the court what came through the walls, and it is the kind of thing you cannot unhear once you know it. She heard Brianna yelling, "Stop, stop, stop," and "Don't hit me," and right after that came the sound of gunshots. Brianna was shot 4 times in the head with a 9mm handgun in the bedroom, and their baby boy Xander was sitting in a playpen only a few feet away, close enough to be inside the same room, young enough not to understand a single thing that was happening, and by some small mercy left physically unharmed. What that same neighbor did next tells you how calm and how normal this man could look even in a moment like that. She moved toward the apartment and saw Francis on his way out, and she confronted him and told him he had to stop beating on her, and he answered, "Yay, I know, I'm sorry, Mom," before walking off like a man heading out to run a simple errand. Only after he was gone did she step inside the unit and find Brianna's body lying on the bed. Police received the call reporting an assault shortly before 11:30 in the morning, and by the time officers arrived on scene, the father of the child was already gone and moving. Francis did not stay to face any part of it. He ran first to New York and then all the way to Solon, Ohio, a suburb outside Cleveland, while a manhunt spread across state lines and police warned the public that he was armed and dangerous. The break in the case came in a way that nobody could have written. On April 17th, nearly 2 weeks after the killing, officers in Solon pulled over a car that Francis happened to be riding in as a passenger, and the stop had nothing to do with the murder at all, because they were actually after the driver. Francis tried to run on foot. They caught him after a short chase, and when they searched the vehicle, they found a loaded 9mm handgun tucked under the passenger seat. That gun was later matched by the state forensic lab to the shell casings pulled from Brianna's bedroom. He was held on a $3 million bond as a fugitive from justice, before Connecticut brought him back home to answer for what he had done. When the case finally reached trial in April 2025, Francis made a choice that shaped everything that followed, choosing to be judged by a panel of 3 judges rather than a jury. His defense did not try to argue that he did not do it. Instead, his lawyer put forward a claim called extreme emotional disturbance, which, if the judges had accepted it, would have knocked the charge down from murder to manslaughter. The argument was that this had been a crime of passion, that Francis had reached a breaking point inside a turbulent relationship, and a Yale psychologist testified on his behalf to try to back it up. The problem was that Francis had told police more than one story, first claiming that he wrestled the gun away from Brianna, and later saying he found it in a drawer while he was searching for money he believed she had taken from him. The judges did not accept any of it. Over a 4-day trial that featured 17 witnesses and 78 pieces of evidence, they unanimously convicted him of murder on April 25th, finding that the emotional disturbance claim fell far short and refusing to give real weight to a psychologist who had leaned mostly on Francis's own self-serving words. The sentencing on June 5, 2025, is where the true weight of it filled the room. More than a dozen of Brianna's family and friends came, and her mother, Camille Hemmings, stood up and asked the judges for the full 60 years, while describing a grief that no medicine and no therapy could ever reach. She told the court that little Xander had not spoken a single word since that day and was in regular therapy to try to bring his speech back, which is its own quiet horror, a toddler who watched his whole world end and simply went silent. The lead judge called it a case that defies description and tests one's belief in a benevolent God, and he made a point of saying that a hard childhood back in Kingston was no excuse to execute the mother of your own child by shooting her in the head. Francis chose to say nothing at all. The panel handed him 55 years in prison out of a possible 60, and afterward, Brianna's mother told reporters that he had finally gotten what he deserved and that she hoped he would die in prison a lonely and miserable death. The prosecutor on the case, State's Attorney Joseph Corradino, called the outcome fair and just, given the gravity of the crime, noting there was very little to soften what Francis had done. That 55 years was really the end of a long road for a family that had been fighting for it from the beginning, all the way back to the arraignment in 2023, where Brianna's mother confronted Francis in open court and called him a murderer and a demon. In the middle of all of it, the family also had to think about the child left behind, and a GoFundMe was set up for baby Xander with a $30,000 goal to help support a boy who lost his mother to domestic violence before he could even really talk. For Ricky Trooper, the man who had spent his whole life controlling a crowd, the loss cracked something open in public. He was granted a compassionate visa to travel to the United States for Brianna's funeral, the same country that had kept him out for years, and he buried his daughter far from home. His pain was made even heavier by the fact that he had buried his own father only months before Brianna was killed, and you can hear both of those losses sitting on top of each other in the way he talked about it in those raw live sessions.
Couple of months ago, I buried my father. Not even get over that yet, you know. Couple of months ago, I buried my father, star, and then this go happen, people. You see me? Baby, innocent star.
He kept repeating the same words over and over, that he was holding it, that it was rough, but he was still holding it, and he leaned on the one thing he had always known how to do, which was play the music. He told his fans that the music was the thing keeping his sanity together, and that even in the middle of all that pain, he still had to work, because when a promoter has already paid you, you get up and you do the job. Then he put words to the thing that every parent is scared to even imagine, the terrible unfairness of burying your own child.
Right? No father and no mother not supposed to have buried them picnic, and your picnic supposed to bury you. See? And your picnic supposed to bury you. And your picnic supposed to bury you. See me I say?
Sadly, Brianna's story is not the only time a Jamaican music family has lost a daughter to this kind of violence on American soil. Back in 2017, reggae singer Anthony Cruz lost his 15-year-old daughter Shanice in Sunrise, Florida, when her mother's partner shot and killed both the mother and the girl before barricading himself inside during a 5-hour standoff. The details are different, since Shanice was a child and the killer was not her father, but the shape of it is painfully close. The same home with prior police calls, the same warning signs, and the same picture of a music world father forced to grieve in front of his whole community. Cruz turned his pain into a warning, saying that arguing and fighting is only human, but that it never gives anybody the right to pull out a gun. 2 families, 1 island, and the same lesson learned the hardest way there is. That is our first story, a young mother killed by the father of her child, all of it playing out in courtrooms and on Instagram Live for the whole world to see. Our second story starts on the other side of that same coin, because this time the person who lost their life was the man, and the person holding the gun was the woman he loved and trusted enough to let move into his home. His name was Stephen Coleman, and the way his life ended is one of the most disturbing cases you will ever sit through. Stephen Coleman was 32 years old, a father, and an aspiring rapper who went by the name Slim Da Don. He was born in 1984 in New Orleans, and he moved to Texas after Hurricane Katrina tore through his city, looking for a more stable life. He found work with ExxonMobil, and the people around him described a man who was clean, family-oriented, and easy to love, someone who spoke with his mother Corla and his brother Chris nearly every single day and doted on his young daughter. His real passion was always music, and by the time he died, he had reportedly written more than 300 songs and even put out a track and video years earlier under his stage name. He had put out a music video years earlier called "Where Did the Music Go?" and friends said he wrote and performed his songs from memory, more than 300 of them stacking up over the years. He had no criminal record and no history of violence, and the people who knew him remembered a man who could light up a room, which is exactly what makes the rest of this so hard to sit with. His young daughter was, in his family's words, his whole world, and the picture that everyone paints of him is a man building a quiet, decent life, one steady day at a time. The woman who ended his life was Sierra Alexis Sutton, who was 30 years old at the time. She worked at a veterinary clinic, she had no prior criminal history of her own, and she had a young daughter from an earlier relationship. She had moved into Stephen's 1-bedroom apartment at Briarwood Village in Baytown, Texas, only a couple of months before, telling him she was dealing with family problems and needed somewhere to stay. So the household that summer was 3 people packed into a small space, Stephen, Sierra, and her 10-year-old daughter, and from the outside, the neighbors thought the 2 of them looked like a completely normal couple, all smiles and small talk, with no sign at all of what was underneath. One neighbor later said there had been nothing that would ever make you think something like this was coming. The friends who knew Stephen best tell a slightly different story, and it is the part that reads like a warning nobody managed to act on in time. 2 of them, women named Elisa De Los Santos and Dominique Clark, said he had confided in them about his fears, and one of them described the relationship as a love-hate thing, where Stephen wanted to walk away, but Sierra did not seem willing to let that happen. Clark said Sierra could play the role of an innocent person and play it to the fullest, which is exactly what she went on to do. The partnership itself was a little uneven from the start. Stephen was the one who rented the apartment and held down the steady job, and Sierra had come to stay with him citing family estrangement and nowhere else to go, which meant he had opened his door to someone at a low moment in her life. He stayed close with his own people the whole time, talking to his mother and brother almost every day, and ending those calls telling them he loved them, the picture of a man with a solid support system who had no reason anyone could see to fear the person sharing his bed. Even the veteran detectives who caught the case were shaken by what they found, with the lead investigator later describing it as a first for his team and struggling to put words to how someone could do this to another human being. Underneath that surface, though, Stephen was uneasy in a way that turned out to matter. He had told friends more than once that if anything ever happened to him, the police should look at Sierra first. There was no documented history of police being called to that home, and no paper trail of abuse, and that absence is exactly why it slipped past everyone. It was just a bad feeling that a grown man carried around and shared quietly with the people he trusted, a feeling that turned out to be dead accurate. And it is worth saying clearly, because his family has fought hard on this point, that there is no evidence Stephen was the abusive one.
In August, I don't miss a day going a month, go and bring flowers. I had to bury what they found.
and his mother has spent years pushing back on anyone who tried to paint her son that way to make the story more sensational. On August 16, 2017, Stephen came home from work and an argument built between the two of them. Nobody has ever laid out exactly what the fight was about, and police never offered a theory. What is known is that Stephen eventually went to bed, and while he was asleep, Sierra shot him once in the head with a handgun. That detail matters more than almost anything else in the case, because it tells you this was not two people fighting when a gun went off in the chaos. He had already walked away from the argument and lay down to sleep, which means she made a decision, waited for him to be at his most defenseless, and then carried it out on a man who never saw it coming. Her 10-year-old daughter was in another room of that small apartment while it happened, close enough to later say she heard noises, and this is a woman with no prior record who worked a regular job at a veterinary clinic, the kind of person you would never pick out of a crowd as capable of what came next. And then the case crossed a line that separates it from almost every other domestic killing you will ever hear about, because what Sierra did next was not blind panic, it was cold, patient work. Here is how a Baytown reporter had to lay the whole thing out for an audience that could barely believe what they were being told. Over the next day or two, inside that same apartment, Sierra took Stephen's body apart in the bathroom and the kitchen, and the reason she later gave for doing it is as cold as anything in this entire video. She told a friend she cut him up because he was too heavy to move in one piece. She wrapped the pieces in sheets and duct tape, and surveillance footage caught a woman matching her description at a local Walmart buying duct tape and a memory foam bed topper with Stephen's own credit card the very day after the killing. Then she spread the remains across several dumpsters at the apartment complex and around Baytown, and those dumpsters were emptied into a landfill out in Chambers County. All of this was happening in the same stretch of days that Hurricane Harvey was bearing down on the Texas coast, which pulled attention and resources away from everything and made the whole trail even harder to follow. What she did after that is the part that truly makes your skin crawl. 2 days later, on August 18th, Sierra filed a missing persons report, claiming that Stephen had left to go find his daughter and simply never came back, even though both of his vehicles were still sitting right there at the apartment. She did not stop at the report either. She joined Stephen's mother, Corla, and his brother, Chris, in handing out flyers and searching for him, riding around in the car with the family of the man she had killed and taken apart, playing the worried girlfriend the whole time. His mother later described the horror of slowly realizing that the woman sitting beside her already knew there was nothing left to find. The illusion held right up until the moment it did not. On August 22nd, an equipment operator at the Chambers County landfill found a man's torso while he was pushing garbage with a tractor. Stephen's own warning to his friends came back around at exactly the right time, because those same friends went to the police and pointed them straight at Sierra, and she had reportedly confessed the whole thing to her best friend and to her brother's girlfriend. When detectives searched the apartment on a warrant, they found blood in the bedroom, the bathroom, the kitchen, and in her Jeep. By then, Sierra had already skipped a follow-up police interview and slipped away to Louisiana. One of the neighbors who spoke to Donald Wooten, a man who lived nearby, had actually gone straight up to her and asked about Stephen while he was still officially just missing, and the way she reacted is its own kind of tell.
To Sierra Sutton directly and asked her what had happened to her boyfriend.
I asked her about him, and she seemed kind of shocked. She goes, "Why are you asking me that?" I said, "Well, I heard that he was missing for a while." And she kind of carried on like she didn't know anything about it.
Now, Baytown police have discovered.
There is one more detail that neighbors gave reporters that still hangs over this whole case, and it is the picture of her in the days right after Stephen vanished, out in the middle of the night doing something no grieving girlfriend would ever be doing.
Now, days after Stephen Coleman disappeared, neighbors tell me they saw Sierra Sutton in the middle of the night cleaning out his apartment, taking out all of the furniture with a couple of other men. She even tried to sell some of that furniture to some of her neighbors. Tonight, she sits behind bars, charged with murder.
Sierra was arrested on September 14th in Jefferson Parish, Louisiana, and the lead investigator on the case said she showed no emotion and no remorse at all. She waived extradition and was brought back to Harris County, where she was charged with murder. What surprised a lot of people, and none more than Stephen's own family, is what she was never charged with. Despite the dismemberment, and despite her young daughter being inside the home during the killing, prosecutors filed no additional counts for tampering with a corpse or child endangerment, and the case moved forward on the single charge of murder. The timing of Hurricane Harvey hung over the whole investigation, because the storm made landfall just days after the torso turned up, and the flooding and evacuations that followed slowed the landfill searches and set detectives back by weeks, which is part of why so much of Stephen was never recovered. In February 2019, Sierra was convicted and sentenced to 45 years in prison before Judge Deshaun Jones in Harris County's 180th District Court, and with no public trial reported, the outcome pointed to a plea deal that closed the case without the family ever getting to sit through a full airing of the evidence. She remains locked up in a Texas prison to this very day. For Stephen's family, the pain did not stop with the sentence, because a whole industry moved in to make money off the way he died. His mother and his brother have spent years pushing back on true crime shows that turned him into a character, painting him as jobless or as some bad man in order to make the story juicier, all of it produced without anyone ever once contacting the family. Shows with names like Storm of Betrayal came and went, more of them kept getting made, and a community activist named Derek Muhammad stood beside the family and called on the production companies to back off a case they were profiting from. Watch his mother describe what watching all of that actually felt like.
Really paint my son as a horrible person, acting with a machete and a knife, blood everywhere.
His family also raised real serious questions about whether Sierra could have pulled all of this off completely alone, pointing to those neighbors who reported two men helping her move furniture, and to the strange fact that nobody in that open apartment layout ever reported hearing a gunshot. His mother could not understand how blood ended up in the bedroom, the bathroom, and the kitchen of a small open space without the child in the home seeing something, and she pointed out that Sierra's young daughter, who reportedly heard noises that night, was never formally interviewed by police. Those questions were never fully answered by anyone, and no charges for child endangerment or for tampering with the body were ever brought. To this day, the family feels shut out of the way Stephen's death gets told and sold, watched by strangers as entertainment, while the people who actually loved him were never once asked to speak. What his mother is left holding is a grave that contains only part of her son, and a ritual she has kept faithfully ever since.
I don't miss a day, a month, go and bring flowers. I had to bury what they found.
If Sierra's case feels like it stands completely alone, sadly, it does not. In 2022, a Wisconsin woman named Taylor Shabiznes strangled her boyfriend Shad Therian and then dismembered his body, scattering the parts around a home and a vehicle, and she was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The methods were different, and drugs played a much bigger role in that one, but the shape of it rhymes in a way experts say is thankfully very rare: a partner killed inside a shared home and then cut apart in an effort to make the crime simply disappear. It is the kind of case that makes you look twice at how little we sometimes really know about the people sleeping right next to us. That is two stories now, a young mother and a young father, both of them killed by someone who was supposed to love them. Both cases eventually settled inside a courtroom. Our third and final story is different in almost every way that matters, because the victim did nothing wrong, knew no one involved, and was chosen completely at random by a stranger who wanted the whole world to watch him do it. The man whose life was taken was Robert Lee Godwin Sr., who was 74 years old. He was born in Alabama in 1942, moved to Cleveland as a young man, and lived most of his adult life on the same street in the same neighborhood. He was a retired foundry worker, a father of 10 children, and a grandfather to 14. The kind of quiet, forgiving man his daughters said lived out his faith every single day. He had lived most of his adult life in the Glenville neighborhood, on a block where everybody knew his name, and the family he raised there stretched wide across the city. He had spent years working in foundries around the city, he loved to fish, and his children grew up on the values he lived out quietly rather than preached at them. His family remembered one simple, gentle habit of his, that he liked to walk through the neighborhood collecting aluminum cans, and on April 16, 2017, which happened to be Easter Sunday, he had just left an Easter dinner with his family and was walking down the street with a bag of cans in his hand. He had no idea that a stranger had already decided a random person was going to die that afternoon to settle a score that had absolutely nothing to do with him. That stranger was Steve William Stevens, a 37-year-old Cleveland man. On the surface, Stevens was not the kind of person anyone would ever have flagged as dangerous. He had worked for about 9 years at a behavioral health agency called Beachbrook, first as a youth mentor and then as a vocational specialist, which means he spent his working days helping young people who needed support. He had no criminal record at all. What he did have was a life quietly coming apart at the financial seams, because he had filed for bankruptcy in 2015, listing more than $35,000 in debt. He had faced 2 separate evictions in the 18 months before the killing, and he blamed the whole collapse on a gambling problem that he said had cost him everything he owned. He was a regular at the Jack Cleveland casino. He had leaned on payday lenders to stay afloat, and by his own telling, the losses had pulled him all the way under. The bankruptcy that was supposed to give him a fresh start had barely held, because within a year and a half of it being discharged, he was already facing eviction again, wages garnished, running out of road. He earned only about $28,800 a year at Beachbrook, which is not a lot to carry that kind of debt on. He held a valid Ohio concealed carry permit, and only 11 days before the murder, he had bought a white Ford Fusion that he would end up using during the crime. There was even a warning his own mother would later hand to police, because he had visited her the day before and told her that if she ever saw him again, it would be a miracle, and it was her call to authorities. After he phoned to say he was shooting people because he was angry at his girlfriend, that helped confirm who they were looking for. There is a detail here that says everything about the disconnect inside this man, because when he filmed his confession, he was still wearing his Beachbrook work badge, the same badge he wore to help troubled young people, and he pointed it out on camera as he talked about killing. A man whose whole job was supposed to be lifting kids up sat there advertising the opposite, and that contrast is part of why this case unsettled people so deeply, because he did not look like a monster, he looked like the guy who might mentor your son. The thread that Stevens kept pulling on, the thing he blamed for everything falling apart, was a woman named Joy Lane, his girlfriend of around 3 years. The two of them had recently broken up, and he told anyone who would listen, in Facebook posts and later on camera, that she and his gambling had driven him right to the edge. Lane herself cooperated with police from the very start, and in a written statement she said only that she was sorry all of it had happened, and that her prayers went out to the family of the victim, before asking for privacy while she tried to make sense of a man she thought she knew. By her own account, they had been serious enough to look at engagement rings together, and he had lived with her and her children and been kind to them, which is part of why none of what came next made any sense to the people who knew him. He had moved out only 2 days before the killing. Months later, after all of it was over, Joy Lane sat down for an interview and tried to explain the man she thought she had known, and it is a strange and heartbreaking thing to hear someone still holding love for a person who did something this monstrous. She was careful, even then, to draw a line between the man she fell for and the person he became, and when the interviewer pushed her on whether people blamed her for what happened, she did not hide from it.
A lot of negative comments. I've been told that I'm the one who should have died. He should have killed me.
On the morning of the killing, Stevens started laying it all out on Facebook, writing that the past year of his life had been ruined, that he had lost everything he ever had to gambling at the casino, and that he was at his breaking point. He told the people reading along that he was, in his own words, on some murder business, and he gave the internet a countdown of sorts before he ever got in the car. It reads now like a man announcing exactly what he was about to do, while everyone scrolled past it, not understanding that he meant every word. He then got into his car, drove into a Cleveland neighborhood, and found Robert Godwin walking along with his bag of cans. The two men had never met and shared no connection whatsoever. Stevens got out, pointed his phone camera and his gun at the old man, and forced him to say Joy Lane's name before telling him that she was the reason this was about to happen to him. Then he pulled the trigger. Here is how a news report described that moment.
Details about that Facebook killer who sparked a national manhunt before he killed himself when cornered by police.
Along with the cold-blooded claim Stevens made in his own voice about how many people he said he had already killed.
I snapped, dog. I just snapped, dog. I just snapped. That's what I did. I killed 13 people, and I'm about to keep killing until.
What made this case explode across the entire planet was not only the murder itself, but the fact that Stevens uploaded the video of it to Facebook, where it sat viewable for more than 2 hours, and pulled in millions of views before the company finally took his account down. He also went on Facebook Live and confessed, claiming that he had killed many more people, a claim that police were never able to verify, and that appears to have been completely false. since Robert Godwin was the only confirmed victim they ever found. But the damage from that video was already done, because a grandfather's murder had become something people were sharing and pressing play on around the world, and Godwin's own grandson had to publicly beg the internet to stop passing it around. The manhunt that followed stretched across several states, with the FBI pulled in and a $50,000 reward placed on the table. Even the Cleveland police chief went on camera to plead with Stevens directly, hoping to bring him in before anyone else got hurt.
Employing Steve to turn himself in, definitely to contact a relative or friend, because there are a lot of folks out there that want to talk to him, want to get this resolved peacefully. So Steve, if you're out there listening, call someone.
The end came just 2 days later. On April 18th, Stevens was spotted at a McDonald's drive-thru in Erie County, Pennsylvania, roughly 100 miles from Cleveland, where employees recognized him, stalled his order to buy time, and called the police. He tried to flee, state troopers gave chase, and after they used a maneuver to force his car to a stop, Stevens took his own life before officers could reach him, with no officers and no bystanders hurt in the final moments. Here is how one report summed up the end of the 2-day hunt that had gripped the whole country. There would be no trial and no day in court, because the only person who could have answered for it was gone, and the aggravated murder warrant that had already been issued for him was never served on anyone. What happened next is the part of this story that truly stays with you, because it did not end in more rage, it ended in something almost impossible to imagine. Only days after the murder, 2 of Robert Godwin's daughters agreed to sit down and meet with Joy Lane, the woman whose name their father was forced to speak in his final seconds. And instead of blame, they offered her comfort and told her that none of it was her fault. And at Robert Godwin's own funeral, his children stood in front of a grieving city and did the single hardest thing a family can ever do. Watch one of them look straight at the camera and forgive the man who took their father.
We do forgive him, and we love him with the love of Christ. We are hurt, we are angry, we are upset. That's a natural human reaction, but we want justice to be served. And we don't want nobody else's family to have to suffer what we did.
They kept coming back to that word forgiveness, not because the hurt was small, but because their faith told them it was the only way through it, and they said it out loud even while the wound was still fresh. The city did not forget him either. That September, Cleveland officially named a section of the street where he had lived for decades Robert Godwin Sr. Way, choosing to mark the way he lived instead of the way he died. The city held a dedication with the mayor and a councilman and dozens of family and friends, and one of his daughters said her father was simply worthy of it, that being able to ride down the street they grew up on and see his name would give the family some peace.
Late sometimes, so late, we would call and say, "Dad, you okay?"
Yeah, we didn't think he was ever coming back.
And he's even said stuff like, he would be down there, and if the wind was real high, he'd be like, "I almost fell over in the lake." I'm like, "Daddy, will you stop?"
At the spot where he fell on East 93rd Street, neighbors and strangers built a growing memorial of flowers, balloons, and candles for a man most of them had never met. One of his daughters later wrote a whole book about moving from grief to grace and finding a way to carry the loss without letting it harden her. His family also went after the platform that let the footage spread, filing a lawsuit against Facebook over how long the video had stayed up. A case that was eventually dismissed, but that forced a real, overdue conversation about what these companies owe the rest of us when this kind of violence gets broadcast on their watch. Facebook itself took heavy criticism for how long the footage stayed up, and in the aftermath, the company said it would hire thousands more people to review reported content faster, an admission of just how badly the moment had gotten away from it. Joy Lane, meanwhile, was left to carry a strange and cruel kind of fallout, because a woman who had done nothing wrong suddenly had her name shouted across the entire country by a killer, and she faced a wave of online hate and threats from people who somehow blamed her for a stranger's death. She talked about not even knowing how to be herself anymore, about trying to pick up the pieces of a life that had been blown apart by someone else's choices. Even after all of that, she spoke about a man she still could not fully let go of, even knowing everything that he had turned into. So there they are, 3 lives tied to the music world and taken far too soon. Brianna McCoy was a young mother, shot in her own bedroom by the father of her child, with their baby watching from a playpen a few feet away. Stephen Coleman was a rapper and a devoted dad, killed in his sleep by the woman he let into his home, then taken apart and thrown away like he was nothing. And Robert Godwin was a grandfather walking home with a bag of cans on Easter Sunday, chosen at random by a stranger who wanted an audience for his cruelty. 3 different cities, 3 different killers, but the same terrible truth running underneath all of it. Here is what these 3 stories are really trying to teach us if we are willing to listen. The danger in Brianna's life and in Stephen's life was not some stranger hiding in the dark. It was the person standing closest to them, the one already inside the front door, and both of them showed a warning sign that the people around them saw but could not stop in time. Robert's story reminds us that some violence is completely senseless, aimed at a person who did nothing at all to deserve it, and yet even that ended with a family choosing forgiveness over hate. Pay attention to the warning signs. Take them seriously when someone you love tells you they are scared, and never let anyone convince you that a person's fear is not worth acting on. Rest in peace to Brianna McCoy, to Stephen Coleman, and to Robert Godwin Sr. If someone in your life keeps telling you to check on a certain person if anything ever happens to them, the way Stephen quietly did with his friends, please do not brush it off as just talk. Drop a comment and tell us which of these 3 cases hit you the hardest. And if you have ever watched someone ignore a warning sign like this, share what you would tell them now, because it just might be the thing that saves somebody else who is watching.